Hello, this is Victor Chen. I'm professor of Management Information Systems at Martin Bismuth School of Business and Economics, California State University, Channel Island. So far, we have kind of introduced the entrepreneurships and the characteristic of entrepreneurs. And last time, we discussed Jeffrey Tinkman's model of entrepreneurship. And in this lecture, we're going to focus on effectuation, which describe how an experienced entrepreneur make decisions. Effectuation theory, which is grounded in empirical research by Saraswati. And you can watch this video to listen to Professor Saraswati's explanation of entrepreneurial methods called effectuation. And it's really just a logic of thinking by experienced entrepreneurs that tends to be more successful if you learn how to think like them. Effectuation begins with a set of means and contingent human aspiration to select from a set of possible effects. So you start with means and then try to choose from a set of possible effects, which can be your goals, which you try to reach. And that's imagined by the effectuator. Effectuator here just means the entrepreneurs. Both mean and aspiration change over time, and what you can achieve change over time. So they are kind of like a moving target. The particular effect selected is a function of the level of loss, which sometimes we call it affordable loss, or risk. The less the loss, certainly the less riskier the situation is. And also how much you want to control your own futures. You're doing this through building some strategic partnerships along the way with various stakeholders. As I mentioned, that effectuation is a set of kind of principle. It's not really just one principle, a set of principles that Professor Saraswati found out through his empirical research among 27 expert entrepreneurs. She gave them a case or cases to solve and analyze their thought process, and eventually concluded with several effectuation principles, which we will introduce soon. And she found out that close to 90% of the expert entrepreneurs use effectuation principle in their decision making. We'll explain effectuation in great detail. It's different than causation, and effectuation tends to be used in a situation which has high uncertainty, and causal reasoning is used when the future is more predictable. With causal reasoning, entrepreneur will determine the goal to achieve and look at for the resource to do so. And for startup firms, the entrepreneur tends to determine the goal according to the resource in their possession. The resource here is equivalent of the mean that we mentioned earlier. So using the diagram to illustrate the concept, managers tend to think by using causal reasoning, which means that they first is given a goal or set a goal, and then they try to figure out what are the means that need to require in order to reach the goal. The effectual reasoning, which tends to be the kind of entrepreneurial thinking, The entrepreneur tends to look at the mean at hand, what kind of means or resources they have, and then figure out a way to set a goal. The goal or the means through creative and imagined thinking could be several, and then they would choose the one which may be more viable due to it may have less risk and which tends to be more affordable, reachable, feasible, etc. And another way of thinking is called strategic thinking. Sometimes it's called creative causal reasoning. And the goal is given, and then you look at what means that you under your control, but at the same time look at additional means externally, and then try to figure out a way to acquire them. And that's called strategic thinking. So in this lecture, we're going to focus on effectual reasoning used by experienced entrepreneurs. The key characteristic is that to imagine possible new ends or goals using a given set of the mean. So this is kind of given, and then you figure out where do you want to go. One analogy or example to illustrate the difference between causation and effectuation is through cooking. I use this example quite a bit when I discuss kind of knowledge management, comparing the Eastern and Western approach. And the causation, it tends to be like more Western style of cooking, which you decided the dishes that you want to cook, and then you have you come up with the recipe for those dishes, and then you find out what ingredient or the means that you need to purchase or acquire. And that's a causation or causal reasoning. And the Eastern or Chinese cooking approach tends to be more effectual process, which means that you look at what you have, what kind of vegetable, the meat that you have in your refrigerator. What do you have? Or you go to the grocery store, you look at what is on sales, what ingredients tends to be fresh and appealing, and you will buy those ingredients without much in your mind what you want to cook. You will purchase things or look at what you have at your hand, and then once you have all those ingredients, and then you can creatively come up with how you may use ingredient to cook some delicious meal. And that's actually very similar to the effectual reasoning that entrepreneurs use. So in effectuation, we identified, in this theory, we identified several principles. We'll explain this principle in detail, but the first is birds in hand, which is regarding the means that's under your control. And another one is called lemonade principle, which means there will be a lot of obstacle and twist and turn in your startup process. And when you encounter some difficulty, you will be flexible and take and adjust your strategy and to overcome the difficulty. This is actually called lemonade principle, which means when life is a lemon, you make lemonade, as the saying goes. So you try to leverage the contingency. The third principle is called crazy quilt principle, which means you try to create strategic partners with your customer, employee, supplier, etc. So the whole endeavor is actually a co-creation process. So we call it co-creation partnerships. That's the principle is called crazy quilt principle. Another important principle is called affordable loss principle. We tend to think about entrepreneur or risk taker, which I have to admit that's my way of thinking. But in this theory, that we've found that entrepreneur tends to try different way to control their loss, and this is called affordable loss. In this way, they have to be really smart and come up with small experiment to test their business idea, and such that they can minimize the potential loss. And so they will focus on the downside, and since once they control the affordable loss, since the loss is not too much, they will take the risk. So on surface, they are the risk taker, but beneath it, it's really they can figure out a way to minimize the loss, such that the loss is more affordable. Then they become a risk taker. Got it? The fifth and the last principle is called pilot in the plan principle, which means that the entrepreneur tends to want to control their own destiny. They want to control the controllable. The last one is really not a principle, but it's the process of effectuation, which we call it effectual cycle, which we'll discuss later, which is a very important process view of the entrepreneur process. Here is kind of a written summary of effectuation principle. Affordable loss, which means you want to set affordable loss. Causal reasoning focus on expected return. Effectual reasoning emphasize on affordable loss. The entrepreneur tends to find way to reach the market with minimal expenditure of resource time, which means time, effort, money. In this course, we'll talk about lean startup. A lean startup tends to has a way to minimize the time and resource required, which is consistent with this affordable loss principle. Birds in hand, look at your means that you have and then figure out what you can do. The means here, including who I am, look at your own trade, taste, ability, and interest. And what I know, which means your own expertise, skill set, education, experience, etc. And which industry you're familiar with. Number 3 is whom I know. Look at your social network. Who do you know and who you can get in touch with to expand your means and reach higher goal. The third principle, crazy quilt, which is partner, collaborate. You try to form partnerships with others. So you need to go out, interact with stakeholders, various stakeholders, including recruiting, founding member for your teams, find the first few customers, find supplier who are willing to produce things that you need, and to obtain their commitment. Okay. Once you have their commitment, then your mean has been increased. And since you have additional means, then the goals or the ends that you can set can be upgraded. Lemonade principle is try to leverage contingency. So when you encounter difficulty, you will pivot and change your business model and make it work. As a saying I mentioned earlier, if life deal you lemon, make lemonade. So you try to embrace surprise that arise from uncertain situation. Try to remain flexible rather than tethered to existing goal. In lean startup, this is actually called pivoting. So they kind of use different terminology to describe similar attitude for a startup firm's strategy or for the entrepreneur, how they deal with various situations. Pilot in the plan is try to take things under your control. You try to control the controllable and take action that's under your control. A little bit of the crazy quilt. This is just example of a crazy quilt. So you try to kind of combine various stakeholder resources, put it together. You are entering a new partnership with supplier, customer, employee, even investor, government agency. And so that will bring the new means or resources to your startup, and hence you can set up newer goals. And so it becomes a virtuous cycle. And through the partnership, you will create unique value network and make you more competitive. And another way to describe this crazy quilt principle is you try to think about broadly how to build an ecosystem with various partners and supplier, etc. And you can also call this kind of whole product concepts are similar. We mentioned, other than the 5 principles discussed earlier, there's something called effectual cycle, which is really the entrepreneurial process based on the effectuation theory. And you start with the mean, which is birds in hand, got it? And then you set your goal. But when you set your goal, you try to choose the path which you can afford the loss. So the affordable loss principle is affecting which goal you would choose to pursue. And once you decided that the goal, then you need to go out and interact with various stakeholders and partner to get their commitment. That is actually called crazy quilt principle. Interact with partner, get their commitment, and the commitment will give you new means and which allow you to set new goals. And once you have new means, then you go through this cycle again, and so it becomes a virtuous cycle with growing resources and aiming bigger goals. In the process, you may encounter some surprise, and you will use the lemonade principle to leverage the surprise, and deal with it with contingency plan. And certainly your goal eventually is to create new product services, reach new market, or creating a new firms. So in this effectual cycle, we're using several of the principles that we discussed previously, the 5 principles: birds in hands, affordable loss, crazy quilt principle, leverage surprise principle, and pilot in the plan principle to some extent is part of it, here and here, to control your own destiny. Comparing causation and effectuations, in causal reasoning, the effects are predicted, are known. You just need to manage the cost, which means the means to reach the end. So we're using a planned approach. Tends to be top-down. It's more managerial, logical thinking. And the prediction is based on, to the extent, the basis is that we can predict the future, so we can control it. Effectuation, sometimes it's called pre-action. The causes are given, the means, resources are given initially. So we need to manage the effect, what we want to reach. We have some flexibility in choosing which path we will take to reach certain goal. So the approach will be emergent. We tends to take a more bottom-up approach. It's a more entrepreneurial logic used by experienced entrepreneur. And it's control based instead of a prediction based, which means to the extent we can control the future, we don't need to predict it. Things will be under our control. But ironically, this is actually used more often in an uncertain situation. The more uncertain situation, we tend to want to do things that's kind of more under our control, but be flexible in dealing with uncertain situation. And in the empirical research, this is kind of the finding. For a startup firm, we tend to think based on effectual logics. However, if you're a novice entrepreneur, you tend to use the causal reasoning. That's tends what we train students in the business school. And however, we found that expert entrepreneurs tend to think more based on effectual reasoning. In large firms, more established and mature firms, they tend to think more based on causal logic. So for a startup firm, you do want to ideally follow the effectual reasoning. And for large firm, you may want to recruit experienced entrepreneurs and give them the freedom to think based on their effectual logics. And so you could renew some of the initiative in your firms. In a book called Just Start, is basically written based on the effectuation theory. It advocates something called pre-action, which encourage people to take actions, but under certain guidance in extreme uncertainty. Their model is pretty simple, very similar to that effectual cycle. First, they do believe that entrepreneurs need to have the desire, the drive we mentioned. They need to take smart steps, and this is very important. The smart step, I kind of break it down into the following. You need to be able to act quickly with the means at hand. This is birds in hand principle. And you stay within acceptable loss. This is called affordable loss earlier. And you want to bring others along. This is actually that crazy quilt principle. And then you reflect and build on what you find from the last action. Okay? And then you take action. And based on the result from the action, you reflect on the findings and decided what to do next. And that's kind of leveraged contingencies. Okay, be flexible. So you learn from the actions and act again. Take another smart step by step, and eventually you reach much higher goal. So this is very action oriented. Okay, smart step means smaller step in the beginning, but step by step you're going to be able to build up your business. If you're interested in this kind of philosophy, there's a book called Just Start, and which tell you how to take action, embrace uncertainty, and then create your own futures. In Just Start, they promote something called prototyping. Prototyping is like prototyping. There's a really good online resource on how you can take a small step to test your idea. And this is actually Palm Pilot's product. But at the very beginning, they actually have a paper mock-up of the device, pretty much just computer printout, drawing the interface. It doesn't cost a lot of money. And that's an example of prototyping. Okay, So it is pretty prototyping. Make sure you're building the right things before you spend a lot of resource on building the product. And the principle is innovator beats just idea. Prototyping beats types. Prototypes beats product types. Okay, and data, concrete data from the field based on the customer feedback, beats your anybody's opinion, pure opinions. Now take action now, doing it now, beats just talking or do it later. Simple, take simple steps, beats any complex design or approach. And try to gain commitment from partners, colleagues, that beats committees. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting thought and mindset as well that's worth paying attention. So go and read this document, prototyping. Last, not the least, this is just another popular rules of the garage for startup. I'm just going to just read it out loud without explaining too much. Believe you can change the world. Remember, that's the pilot in the plan. Work quickly, keep the tool unlocked, and work whenever. Take actions. Know when to work alone, when to work together. Okay. Share two ideas. Trust your colleague. You do need to have a trustworthy team that you can work with. No politics, no bureaucracy. And the customer define a job well done. So basically, you need to go out of your garage and your building to be in touch with the customer and validate your ideas or products by the customer. And you're encouraged to think radically, to come up with radical ideas. They're not bad ideas. You try to invent different way of working so you can differentiate with others. You try to make contribution every day in your garage. You believe that together we can do anything, which is partnership, crazy quilt principle, and invent. Okay, come up with new ideas, new products, new business model, etc. So this concludes our discussion of effectuation, and that pretty much conclude our 4 lectures on entrepreneurships and entrepreneur. Thank you for your listening, and I'll see you soon.